The knock came at 5:47 inches the morning. I heard it before I was fully awake, 3 hard raps on the passenger window of my truck, the kind that don't apologize for the hour. My neck had stiffened overnight where it bent against the door, and my breath had fogged the glass so thick I couldn't see who was standing out there. I wiped a circle with my sleeve and found a woman in a county uniform staring back at me, her face unreadable in the gray November light. I rolled the window down 2 inches. "Sir, you can't sleep here. This is county property." "I know," I said. "I'm sorry. I'll move." She looked at me the way people look at problems they didn't create and don't want. I was 63 years old, parked behind the Larimer County Administrative Building in Fort Collins, Colorado, sleeping under a moving blanket I'd bought at a dollar store. My name is Robert Henderson. 31 years ago, I stood in front of a classroom of 17-year-olds and taught them American history. For the last 22 of those years, I ran the whole school. I had a pension coming. I had a house with a paid-off second bedroom. I had a wife named Sandra who I believed, with everything I had, still loved me. I had a lot of things once. She left on a Tuesday in March. Not dramatically, Sandra was never dramatic. She simply came downstairs while I was eating breakfast and set a manila folder on the table next to my coffee mug and said her brother Paul had drawn up the papers and she'd appreciate it if I didn't make this ugly. I remember staring at the folder like it was something that had fallen from a great height and landed in a place that made no sense. We had been married 26 years. I had met her in a continuing education class. She was studying landscape design. I was finishing my administrator's certification. We had a daughter together who was grown and living in Austin. We had arguments and reconciliations and a kitchen remodel 2 summers ago that went 3 weeks over schedule because the contractor kept changing his estimates. I learned later that Sandra had been sleeping with that contractor since the 2nd week he was in our house. His name was Derek. He was 44, which put him 11 years younger than my wife and 19 years younger than me. He drove a black pickup with his company name on the door, and apparently he had a very charming way of explaining why costs were running over. I'm not being bitter. I'm just telling you the facts as I eventually understood them because at the time I understood nothing. At the time I sat at my own kitchen table and opened that folder, thinking there had to be some mistake, some conversation I'd missed, some version of events that would explain why the woman I'd shared a bed with for more than 2 decades was handing me divorce papers before I'd finished my eggs. Paul was a family law attorney in Denver. He was Sandra's younger brother. And I'd always found him a little slick, the kind of man who kept his hair too neat and laughed at his own jokes a half second before they landed. I didn't know, when I saw his name on those documents, that I was already in serious trouble. I thought I would hire my own attorney and we would negotiate like adults and I would walk away with half of what we'd built together. That is what I thought. What happened instead was that Paul had spent the previous 4 months documenting, mischaracterizing, and in some cases simply fabricating a financial picture in which my pension and retirement contributions were classified under provisions that minimized my claim to them, while the equity in our home, which I had made the larger contributions toward for 26 years, was structured around Sandra's role as primary household manager. There were affidavits. There were spreadsheets. There was a filing in Denver County rather than Larimer, which Paul's colleague recommended as strategically favorable, and by the time my attorney caught the implications of that venue choice, it had already been accepted. The attorney I hired cost me $14,000. He was not Paul. He was a general practitioner who handled divorces the way a mechanic handles an engine he's only read about. Every motion Paul filed, my attorney needed 2 weeks to respond to. Every response Paul countered within 48 hours. I watched my legal fees climb past $30,000 before the first hearing. I will not go through every detail of what the next 8 months cost me. I will only tell you the outcome. I kept my 2009 Ford F-150, which had 187,000 miles on it and a slow leak in the front left tire. I kept approximately $9,400 in a checking account. I kept my clothes, my books, and a box of things from my classroom that I'd already brought home when I retired the previous June. Sandra kept the house. Sandra kept the investment accounts we had built together. My pension was divided such that she would receive a portion when I began drawing it. My attorney told me this was, in his assessment, not the worst outcome he'd seen. I drove out of our neighborhood for the last time on a Wednesday afternoon, with everything I owned in the bed of my truck under a tarp. I want to be honest about what the next few months felt like, because I think people who haven't been through it imagine grief looks a certain way, and it doesn't. It doesn't look like crying in parking lots, although there was some of that. It mostly looks like waking up at 3 in the morning in the cab of a truck and doing arithmetic. I had $9,400. A cheap motel room in Fort Collins was $58 a night, which was $1,740 a month, which meant my money would last about 5 months and then I would have nothing. I had applied for 3 part-time positions in September, 2 of which never called back, and 1 of which told me politely that they were looking for someone with more flexible availability, which I understood to mean someone younger. I was 63 years old with a master's degree in educational administration and 31 years of experience running a public high school, and I could not get hired to answer phones. I stopped paying for motel rooms in October. I found a 2-4-hour gym where a monthly membership cost $24 and I could shower every morning. I found the spots where overnight parking was least likely to result in a knock on the window. The back lot of a church on Shield Street that only filled on Sundays, the far end of the Walmart on College Avenue, and on the colder nights when I wanted to feel less conspicuous, the county administrative complex on Timberline Road, where the overnight security guard changed shifts at 4 a.m., and the lot was dark and quiet, which is where I was on that Tuesday in November, when the county employee knocked on my glass. I rolled up my window and started the engine. She was already walking away. I watched her go and then sat for a moment with the heat running, watching the sky go from black to gray to the particular pale nothing of a November morning in Colorado. I was thinking about my daughter in Austin, who called every Sunday and had offered twice to wire me money, and both times I had told her I was fine and staying with a friend from work. She was 24 and just starting her career, and I was not going to become her problem. I was 63 years old. I had handled things before. I drove to the county building because I needed to file for a contractor's license renewal. I had been doing odd jobs, small repairs, fence work, some painting, and I needed the license current if I was going to keep doing it legally. The work paid inconsistently, $200 here, $350 there. Enough to keep gas in the truck and food in the small cooler I kept behind the seat. The licensing office opened at 8. I was third in line. The woman at the counter was in her 50s with reading glasses on a beaded chain, and the efficient manner of someone who has processed 10,000 pieces of paperwork and intends to process 10,000 more. She took my renewal form, my old license, and my ID. She typed for a moment. Then she stopped. She looked at her screen. Then she looked at my ID again. Then back at the screen. Mr. Henderson? Yes. Robert James Henderson? Social ending in 4,417? That's right. She picked up her phone and dialed 2 digits. Janet, can you come out here for a second? A pause. No, it's not just come. Look at this. A younger woman came through a door behind the counter. They both looked at the screen. The younger one, Janet, turned and looked at me with an expression I could not entirely decode. It was not alarm. It was not suspicion. It was something closer to the look people get when they find a $50 bill in an old coat. Mr. Henderson, Janet said. Have you had any contact recently with the Bureau of Land Management? No, I said. There's a federal administrative hold on your file. It's been here for, she leaned toward the screen, 31 months. It's from the Department of the Interior, Mineral Rights Division. It says owner verification required, unclaimed interest. She looked up. Do you own any land in Wyoming? I stood at that counter for a long moment. My father did, I said. He passed away in 2019. He had some land up near Torrington. Bought it in the late 80s, I think. I don't know what happened to it after he died. My brother handled his estate. Is your brother, she checked the screen again, David Allen Henderson? David passed in 2021, I said. Pancreatic cancer. Janet and the other woman exchanged a look. Janet said, "Mr. Henderson, I think you need to call this number." She wrote something on a post-it note and slid it across the counter. "I can't tell you more than what's on this screen, but I think you should call them today, not next week, today." I took the note. I renewed my contractor's license. I walked out into the parking lot and sat in my truck for 5 minutes, looking at that post-it note before I dialed. The man who answered was named Gerald Ashworth. He worked in the Denver field office of the Bureau of Land Management, and he had a measured, careful way of speaking that reminded me of attorneys or doctors delivering news they want to make sure you've heard correctly. He asked me several verification questions. My mother's maiden name, my father's full name and approximate date of birth, the county of record for my childhood home. When I answered the last one, he was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Henderson," he said, "your father filed a joint mineral rights claim on 847 acres in Goshen County, Wyoming, in August of 1988. The co-claimants were himself, you, and your brother David. Your father's interest passed to your mother at his death, and she released her claim to you and your brother in her own estate. Your brother's share reverted to you at his death as the surviving co-claimant per the original filing terms." He paused. "We have been attempting to reach you for nearly 3 years at addresses that were no longer current." I said, I moved. "I understand. Mr. Henderson, I need to ask, are you familiar with what's been happening on that land?" I told him I was not. He explained it to me in the careful, measured way of a man who has delivered unexpected news before and knows that the first telling doesn't fully land. A natural gas company, he gave me their name, a mid-sized independent out of Casper, had been developing the adjacent parcels since 2019. They had conducted seismic surveys on the Henderson claim in 2020 without having secured rights, which was an unauthorized use. When their title search caught the error in 2021, they had filed a formal interest notification with the BLM and begun attempting to contact the registered claimants. My father was deceased. My brother was deceased. I had moved twice since the last address on file. The company had been holding the negotiated rights value in escrow for 31 months, waiting for owner verification. Gerald Ashworth told me the figure. He said it carefully. The way you hand something fragile to someone who might drop it. I asked him to repeat it. He did. I was sitting in a parking lot in Fort Collins, Colorado, in a 2009 Ford F-150 with 187,000 miles and a slow leak in the front left tire, and Gerald Ashworth from the Bureau of Land Management was telling me that a natural gas company had placed $2.3 million in escrow against my mineral rights, with an additional royalty structure based on projected extraction that his office estimated at between $90,000 and $140,000 annually for the duration of the lease. I said, "I see. I don't know why I said that. It was the only thing that came out." Gerald told me I would need to come to the Denver field office with documentation death certificates for my father and brother, proof of identity, the estate release from my mother's estate if I had it. He said the process for releasing the escrow would take 4 to 6 weeks, once documentation was verified. He said I should consider consulting an attorney before signing anything with the gas company, because the royalty structure was still being negotiated, and there was room to improve the terms. I thanked him. I hung up. I looked through my windshield at the parking lot and the gray sky and a Burger King cup rolling in the wind, and I sat there for a long time. Then I did something I am not proud of. I cried. Not quietly, actually cried. The kind that bends you forward over the steering wheel and makes sounds you didn't know were stored in you. I am 63 years old, and I had been sleeping in my truck for 6 weeks, and I had told my daughter I was fine, and I had stopped calling most of the people I used to know because I couldn't figure out how to explain what had happened to my life. And the weight of all of that came out at once in the parking lot of the Larimer County Administrative Building on a Tuesday morning in November. After a while, I stopped. I wiped my face. I found the documents I needed. It took me 10 days to gather everything. My brother's death certificate required a request to the Natrona County Clerk's office. My mother's estate release had been filed with a law firm in Cheyenne that took 3 phone calls to locate. I borrowed a scanner at the Fort Collins Public Library to send copies to Gerald Ashworth's office before driving down to Denver with the originals. I hired an attorney. Not the one from the divorce, a different one. A woman named Patricia Donnelly, who specialized in mineral rights and natural resources, and who, when I explained my situation in her office on a Wednesday afternoon, looked at the BLM correspondence and the escrow documentation and said, "Without any particular drama, Mr. Henderson, you have been significantly underserved by your previous legal representation." Patricia reviewed the royalty structure the gas company had proposed and negotiated it upward. She also filed a complaint with the Colorado Bar Association regarding certain practices in my divorce proceedings, specifically Paul's dual role as Sandra's brother and her legal representative without disclosing a financial interest in the marital property outcome, and the Denver venue filing, which Patricia described as a textbook example of forum shopping that my previous attorney had failed to challenge properly. The bar complaint did not undo what had been done, but it initiated a review that, several months later, resulted in a sanction and a mandatory remediation proceeding. As part of that proceeding, and upon Patricia's demand, a portion of the asset division was reopened. I will not pretend this part was satisfying in the way revenge stories are supposed to be satisfying. It was slow and administrative and full of paperwork. Paul did not lose his license. Sandra did not lose the house was legally hers and remained so. What I recovered was a partial recalculation of the pension division and a reimbursement of certain legal fees that had been inflated. It was not nothing. It was not everything. It was justice the way justice usually comes incomplete, late, and requiring a lot of waiting room time. What I will tell you about Sandra is this. She found out about the mineral rights through my daughter, who I had finally told the truth to about everything in January, and who I think felt she needed to share some of it with her mother. I understand that. They are close. I don't hold it against either of them. Sandra called me in February. This was approximately 2 months after the escrow had been released and 3 weeks after Patricia had begun the bar complaint process, so Sandra had had some time to understand the general shape of things. The call was brief. She wanted to know if the mineral rights income would be subject to division. Patricia had already researched this. The claim originated in 1988, 12 years before our marriage. My mother's estate release, signed after our separation, transferred interest that had been held outside marital property throughout our marriage. Sandra's position was, legally, weak. Patricia told her as much through a formal letter. Sandra did not call again after that. I want to be accurate about Derek, too, since I know people expect a certain kind of ending for him. He and Sandra are, as far as I know, still together. He remodeled 2 more kitchens in our neighborhood before his contractor's license was suspended for a separate issue involving permit fraud that had nothing to do with me. I didn't cause that. I didn't know about it until my neighbor mentioned it in passing. I felt nothing particular. Maybe a small, tired recognition that the universe moves at its own pace and doesn't need my help. The thing I think about most, now, is the 8-year-old version of my father buying 847 acres of flat Wyoming land in the summer of 1988 because he thought the price was right and the area was growing and he wanted something to leave his boys. He was a mechanic from Cheyenne who had never owned anything larger than the house where we grew up. He died in 2019, having never received a cent from that land. And my brother died in 2021 the same way, and neither of them ever knew what was underneath it. I think about that a lot, the way things sit quietly underground for decades, waiting for someone to find them. I moved to a small town in southern Colorado in the spring. I rented a house, actually rented, the first time in 30 years I'd paid rent rather than a mortgage, and there was something unexpectedly simple about that. I bought a used car that was more reliable than the truck, though I kept the truck too because I had gotten attached to it in the way you get attached to things that carried you through hard times. My daughter came to visit in April. We sat on the back porch, and she told me she'd been worried about me since October, that she'd known I wasn't staying with any friend from work, that she'd Googled Fort Collins shelters and support services just in case. I told her she should have been a detective. She said she'd been afraid to ask directly because she thought I'd insist I was fine and she didn't want to make me feel worse by not believing me. I told her I understood. I told her I was actually fine now and that this time I meant it. I've been teaching one class per semester at the community college in town American history, which is where I started, which feels right. The students are mostly in their 20s and occasionally ask questions that are so direct they catch me off guard. Last month, one of them asked me, during a discussion of the Homestead Act, whether I thought land ownership in America was still meaningful or whether it had become something only corporations and lawyers could navigate successfully. I thought about my father, who was a mechanic from Cheyenne. I thought about 847 acres of flat Wyoming land bought for reasons that seemed small at the time. It's navigable, I said. You just need more patience than feels reasonable, and you need to make sure you have the right help. They wrote it down, the way students do when they think something will be on a test. I don't know if it will be, but I meant it as something larger. There is one more thing I should tell you, because I think it matters to the whole shape of what happened. After the Denver meeting with Gerald Ashworth, after the paperwork and the signatures and the initial escrow release, I drove back to Fort Collins and stopped at the county administrative building. Not for any official reason. I went to the licensing counter and asked if Janet was working. She was. I told her I'd made the call and that things had worked out. She smiled the way people smile when something unexpectedly good happens to someone they don't know, which is a particular kind of generous smile I hadn't seen in a while. I asked for her supervisor's name because I wanted to write a letter. Janet looked embarrassed and said that wasn't necessary. I said it was necessary to me. I wrote the letter that evening in a coffee shop on College Avenue, the first coffee shop I'd been in since October because before that I'd been managing every dollar. I wrote that Janet had treated me with professionalism and kindness during what I later understood had been a significant moment, and that the way she had handled the situation directly, clearly, without condescension had made a genuine difference. I mailed it the next morning. I don't know if it did anything. I hope it did something. I think about the whole of it sometimes. The years of marriage and the kitchen renovation and Paul's manila folder on the breakfast table, and the 6 weeks in the truck and the parking lot, and Gerald Ashworth's careful voice on the phone and the $2.3 million sitting in an escrow account for 31 months, waiting for me to appear. I think about how close I came to not appearing. How many times I could have moved to a different city, let the contractor's license lapse, stopped opening mail from agencies I didn't recognize. How the whole chain depended on a county clerk running a routine ID check and pausing. I don't believe in fate, particularly. I believe in my father buying land he thought was worth something and putting his son's names on it. I believe in a woman named Janet who looked at something on a screen and decided it was worth a phone call to her supervisor. And I believe this is the thing I didn't believe in October. Sleeping in my truck and counting the weeks before my money ran out, I believe that 63 is not a conclusion. It is not the final chapter of anything. It is, if you're lucky and stubborn and willing to file the right paperwork, sometimes closer to the beginning of something you couldn't have planned. I have a porch now. I have my daughter's phone number in my favorites. I have a class on Tuesday and Thursday mornings full of 20-year-olds who want to argue about history, which is the best argument worth having. My father bought 847 acres of Wyoming land in the summer of 1988 because he thought it might be worth something someday. He was right. He was just 35 years early.